I'm sure we've all received gardening advice from a friend or other gardeners, but that advice is not always good or true. Today, we're going to take a look at a list of 10 common gardening advices that people give out that tend to get repeated a lot, but they're not always true, or maybe they just need to have some context around them. Hi, I'm Heidi from Garden Crossings, and today we are going to dig into some myths or things that are told to gardeners that may not actually be true. So, especially if you are a new gardener and are looking for some good, solid advice, this is a good video for you to be watching. For those of you who are experienced gardeners, I think you might even find a few things here that you may learn as new as well. So if you're looking for good and accurate advice, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and ring that notification bell to be notified when the next video airs. So the first thing people always will say, or a lot of times you'll hear, is water every day. So this is not necessarily true. Daily watering can actually weaken plants by encouraging shallow roots and increasing disease. Most gardens do better with deep, less frequent watering adjusted to the soil type, the weather that's going on for that time of year, and the plant's needs. So this is particularly true if you're planting in the ground, although we're going to also talk a little bit about container planting as well. So you've got your early summer versus your later summer. It doesn't tend to be as hot in the spring and the summer as what it does to be midsummer or in the fall. So the temperature of when you're looking at in the season can vary what you're going to do and how much water your plants are going to need. If you've got a cloudy day, plants don't tend to dry out as fast. On windy days, plants dry out faster. On rainy days, obviously Mother Nature is doing the job for you by getting your plants watered. And certainly on hot days, those are days that you do have to pay more attention to how much water is your garden needing for that hot situation. If water sets on the leaves, this can actually cause mildew and spotting. Also, too much water can cause root rot if it doesn't drain away. Sandy soil, that drains really fast, and clay soil can hold moisture or it can also repel it. So you want to make sure that you know what your soil is and how it reacts to watering when you determine how much water you want to put on your plants. Also, too, certainly some plants are thirstier than others. So two that come right to my mind are hydrangeas or sun patiens. They tend to be thirstier plants, especially in the heat of the summer. Your plants will tell you, that they need more water when they start to wilt. Both hydrangeas and sun patiens do bounce back fairly quickly once you go out to give them some water. They'll drink it up, and usually within an hour or two, they're perked back up and looking good. But definitely pay attention to what your plants are telling you when it comes to watering your containers and in your garden. Plants like succulents, obviously those type of plants, they hold water, so they do not need as much water as a lot of other garden type varieties. I'm sure you've often heard more fertilizer means bigger, better plants. Well, more isn't always better. So too much fertilizer can cause a lot of leafy growth with fewer flowers. It can burn the roots. It can even kill plants in some situations. Feeding should be balanced and timed, not consistent. Now, I do have to put in a little disclaimer there. We do recommend, if you have containers with annuals in them, especially once the weather starts getting warmer and you're watering them more, that you do about once a week water them with your favorite water-soluble fertilizer. So let's take a little deeper look into the fertilization and how it should be done. So with annuals, most annuals in containers, as I mentioned, we recommend fertilizing once a week once you get to that heat of the summer. An exception, though, would be sun patiens. So one thing we learned is sun patiens do not love fertilizer. So the more you fertilize them, you're going to notice that they stop blooming or that their buds, there's just not as many. And we noticed that we were over fertilizing them and we couldn't figure out why was our sun patiens not blooming. Finally, we figured it out. The reason it was we were over fertilizing. So we cut back on fertilizing the sun patiens. If you do need to fertilize or feel like you want to fertilize those sun patiens, don't do it very often. And I would recommend doing it with more of a diluted down or not so concentrated water soluble fertilizer. The type of fertilizer you use matters too. We recommend the Proven Winners water-soluble fertilizer because what that does is it encourages greener foliage and more flower output. They have it specially formulated so that it gets your greens greener and just really pushes out the flowers. There's a special iron they use in the fertilizer. And even if your plants are bound up, which can happen, and they can't absorb the fertilizer or the iron in the fertilizer, with a proven winter fertilizer, they will, even your bound up plants can absorb that fertilizer to keep them looking healthy. With perennials, early spring is kind of the most important time of year to fertilize your perennials. Just apply as new shoots start pushing up or when new growth appears. You want to fuel that season's growth. So in the spring, it's a good time to give those perennials that boost that they need to look fabulous all summer long. Midsummer is optional if you want to feed your perennials. For heavy feeders or plants that bloom a second time, like salvia or other plants, if you've trimmed them back, deadheaded them, and you're waiting for another cycle of blooms, then go ahead, give them that midsummer fertilizer. A light feeding after the first bloom cycle and after cutting back can encourage more flowers. Now, when should you stop fertilizing those perennials? Do not fertilize after mid to late summer, kind of that July, August time period. Because what this is doing is as you get later in the season, that fertilizer is continuing to push growth. So by not fertilizing late in the season, it's preventing that soft late season growth that can't harden off before the first frost. Now, shrubs, how should you be fertilizing your shrubs? So shrubs too like to be fertilized in the early spring, like perennials do. Depending on where you live, will a little bit depend on when you fertilize. But for those of you in warmer climates, you can start fertilizing somewhere around late February or March. For us here in Michigan, it's probably going to be more around April or so. You want to start fertilizing when the soil is workable, but before the buds on the plant start to swell. So that's when it's ideal to do those spring feedings on those shrubs. With new shrubs, though, newly planted shrubs, ones that are usually under a year old or so, generally don't need fertilizer. You really want those shrubs to focus on the root development first. So you want the energy to go down into the ground, because if they have strong roots, that's what's going to continue to keep them going year round, year after year. So a lot of times the saying is the first year is for growing, second year is for showing. So that rings true for a lot of perennials and shrubs. So just kind of keep that in mind. So when should you skip fertilizing? Healthy plants, if your shrubs are vigorous and green, they likely don't need fertilizer. If your plants have drought stress, do not fertilize drought-stressed plants. Ensure that they have adequate water first. Have you ever heard somebody say, full sun means all day sun? Not always. So full sun usually means about 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight, not sunrise to sunset. Some plants actually struggle in intense afternoon heat, even if they are labeled for full sun. And another thing to keep in mind is not all sun is the same. Morning sun is usually not as intense than their afternoon sun. So when I tell somebody, make sure it's getting the good sun of the day, that would be the afternoon sun. Also, too, northern sun differs from southern sun. It's just our sun up in the north here, we're in Michigan, is not as intense as the sun is for those of you that are in the south. Have you heard that leaves should always be cleaned up in the fall? Leaf cleanup and trimming. This is a very debatable one, and it can be a sore subject to talk about. So a lot of people will say, you shouldn't do any cleanup in the fall, and others are like, I want to clean up in the fall. So let's take a little bit of a closer look to cleaning up the leaves in the fall. So while cleanup helps prevent diseases, fallen leaves can also insulate plants. It can improve your soil. It makes compost and such. And two, I think the biggest reason a lot of people say just leave your leaves in the fall is because it supports pollinators. And it depends on the plant, the disease pressure, and what your garden goals are for if you want to remove those leaves or deadhead your plants. I like to tell people that it's a personal preference. So when do you have the time? When do you have the time to get out in your garden and do the cleaning? I like to clean up in the fall. That's when I have time. Obviously, the spring we are very busy and we don't have time to get out in our garden. So for us, we do a lot for the pollinators. If you've watched our videos at all, we do a lot for the pollinators. But one thing that we have to do is fall cleanup. I don't like cleaning up plants when they're mushy. I prefer to do it while they're still just a little bit crisp. They probably turn brown, but once they turn mushy, like I don't like to do that. I just like to have a nice, tidy fall cleaned up garden. Some people want to clean up in the spring, and that's great as well. There's not a right or wrong way, and I think that's what's important. Is people always will tell you this is the way it has to be done, and I'm going to tell you do it when it works for you. Yes, there are some plants that you do have to be careful of when you're trimming them, but just make gardening simpler for yourself. Do it when it works for you and when it makes you happy. This is a good place to say, though, know your shrubs and also know your perennials. So with some flowering shrubs, they cannot be trimmed in the fall. And the reason is because they are setting their buds for the next season's flowers. So make sure you know your plants and you know when they bloom, or if they bloom off of old growth or off of new growth, because that's going to be very important. One kind of rule of thumb, now this isn't always true, but I do find that it's true a decent amount of times, is if your shrubs are spring flowering, they more than likely are setting their buds in the fall. So spring flowering shrubs, if you need to do trimming on them, usually we would recommend trimming them after they're done blooming. But if your shrubs are more fall or later on in the season, a lot of times those are going to be the ones that bloom off of the new growth. So trimming can be done in the fall or in the spring. So just make sure you know what you're growing and when it should be trimmed. What about native plants? Have you heard that they don't need any care? They're tougher, but they're not maintenance free. Native plants still need watering while they're getting established. They need occasional dividing, and you have to think about thoughtful placement when you're planting them. They're not a plant it and forget it solution. So they do tend to be more drought tolerant. They do adapt well to your local conditions. They are usually lower maintenance, but why this statement is misleading is because they still need water, especially within the first year or two while they're putting on new growth and getting established in your garden. They too have to make for sure that they get planted at the proper depth, the proper spacing, and you want to make sure that you're prepping your soil properly. If these things aren't being done, native plants too may not do well in your garden. Also make sure that you're keeping your weeds under control. You don't want to have your native plants, or really honestly any of your plants in your garden, have to struggle because they're competing with weeds. So keeping the weeds out of the garden is going to really make any plant happier. Also too, native plants may need occasional pruning. Think about your native shrubs. If you let them go wild, they'll look wild. But if you give them occasional trimming or pruning, that will keep them looking nice and tidy. Native plants are not exempt from pests and diseases, so you do also have to make sure that you're checking on them just like you would any of your plants for pests and diseases, or even stress to the plant that may be making it just not its best. So a better way to look at it is natives need care in the beginning, but often need less care once they're established. Natives are low maintenance, not no maintenance. Has anyone ever told you that perennials bloom all summer? Well, the fact of the matter is, most don't. Many perennials will bloom for weeks, not months. A long blooming garden usually comes because they've layered their perennials. They've planted many different varieties that are blooming at different times. They're not relying on one perennial plant to keep that garden in color all season long. You can encourage a rebloom on some perennials by trimming them back after they're done blooming. This is also called deadheading. So if you've ever heard the phrase deadheading before, that's what it means. It means removing or trimming spent blooms. We do have a video on long blooming perennials, so we'll put that down in the YouTube description. So that way, if you want more information on some perennials that are long blooming, you can access and watch that video to make a list if that's something that you're interested in. So let's go back to the layering. We recommend knowing when your perennials bloom and plant according to when they bloom. So some will bloom early in the season, mid-season, late season. It's always good to make sure that you have those early season bloomers to kick the garden off, but you also don't want your garden to be totally, just looking like nothing at the end of the season. So make sure that you also put some late season bloomers as well. We like to pop a few annuals in our garden because annuals will give us a consistent splash of color throughout the season. So as those perennials are cycling through from one to the other, you've got those annuals that are just constantly carrying that color through and giving your garden a little bit of excitement while those perennials are kind of changing in the background. Houseplants die because you didn't water enough. Have you ever heard that? Actually, the problem is with houseplants dying, usually it's not because you're not watering enough. 9 times out of 10, when your houseplants are dying, it's because you've overwatered them. Houseplants will a lot of time die from root rot. Those roots are sitting in soggy soil that doesn't have time to get dried out. Drainage and the type of soil you're planting those houseplants in matter just as much as watering. Houseplants do not have the outdoor elements to dry them out like the outdoor plants do. There's usually not a lot of sun. There's no wind, which we know wind dries plants out. And they're in a more climate controlled area. They're sitting in your AC, or, a lot of us have AC, not all of us do. But a lot of times they're in a more consistent temperature. So they're not having those really hot spells and really cold spells. So they're not going through the water as often as plants that are planted outside do. So just make sure that you know the house plants you're growing, you know their what they like as far as how much water. But I tend to actually, my plants, especially behind me here, they go a long time between watering. And I feel like they do better if I'm just kind of starving them of water a little bit, opposed to keeping them always wet. And I was going to say always happy, but they're not always happy when that soil is always moist. So it's okay with most houseplants to just kind of let them dry down a little bit in between watering. Bigger pots mean better growth, only to a point. Oversized containers can hold too much moisture, leading to root rot. See, a lot like the indoor plants that aren't able to dry out, that can happen with large pots as well. Plants like a pot that fits a root system, not a massive upgrade. The problem is, one of the biggest problems is that there's too much wet soil. When a pot is much larger than the plant's root system, the roots can't absorb all the water. There's just not enough roots on those plants to absorb all the water that's in those big pots. So that soil, it stays soggy and wet for too long. The roots sit in those soggy conditions, and that can lead to root rot. If you've not heard of root rot before, that's one of the most common causes of plant failure. The roots grow before the tops. Plants focus on filling the pots with roots first. In an oversized pot, the plant puts its energy into the root growth instead of into the leaves and the flowers. Above ground growth slows down or stalls, and the plant may look like it's stuck, or even possibly that it's not alive. Especially, when we're looking to encourage flowers on our plants, but we want all that energy to really go as much into the flowers as it can so we can enjoy those flowering potted containers throughout the summer. Also, sometimes in big pots, there can be a little bit of nutrition imbalance. If the pot's too big, the fertilizer will spread out through all that unused soil, and the roots can't access those nutrients efficiently. Oftentimes, too, when you do that, because that fertilizer is not getting used, salts can build up, and that can also cause root damage. Keep in mind when planting up containers how fast the root growth will be of the plant you're planting. I always go a bit bigger for my annuals though, because annuals typically are pretty fast growers, as are their roots, and they can quickly fill up a container. And if those annuals and their roots are filling up a container really quickly, this also causes for needing to water more often. So basically, if you're planting a shrub or a perennial into a container, the rule of thumb is a couple inches bigger than the pot you're starting with. So if you have a gallon pot, let's say you have an 8-inch gallon pot, they're going to recommend planting in maybe a 10-inch pot. I'm going to say go just a little bit bigger because, you don't want to have to transplant that shrub or perennial every year. So if you're starting off with an 8-inch pot, you could probably plant into a 12-inch pot and have it be an appropriate size for growing on that perennial or shrub for a year or possibly 2 before it will need another upgrade. With annuals, I will pack my pots full. So if I'm planting up annuals, I'm going to plant up a 15-inch planter with 5 4.5-inch pots. I know that those pots are going to quickly fill in that container and make me just a huge ball of beauty, a huge mass of color. So annuals, I do think, are a little bit different with kind of where we're looking at that big pot, small pot thing. But just make sure with your annuals that you kind of know how aggressive they are, because I will say with annuals, I am going to recommend bigger pot than smaller pot, because you want those annuals to be able to live and last and just put on that show of color throughout the entire summer. You don't want them to outgrow their pots before the season ends. All flowers attract pollinators. That is not true. So some flowers are bred for looks over nectar and pollen. Double blooms, sterile hybrids, and even certain colors of flowers don't tend to attract those pollinators, or they'll attract very few pollinators. Not all flowers are good food sources for the butterflies and the bees. Many flowers are bred for their looks. They have a bigger flower, a brighter flower, fuller habit, longer bloom time. But what that can mean is little to no pollen, little to no nectar, and flowers that are just too close together or just too many petals for the pollinators to be able to get in and access any pollen or nectar that there might be. If the pollinators can't reach the food, they're going to move on to the next best thing they can find. So we don't always plant plants for nectar and pollen, right? Sometimes we're planting them for our beauty, but I think it's good to have a nice mix of planting plants, not only for the pollinators, but for our enjoyment and beauty as well. So what do the pollinators really prefer? They prefer open, simple blooms, easy to access the nectar and the pollen. And they enjoy flowers that bloom at the right time of year. So you've got your early season pollinators and you have your late season pollinators. You want to make sure that you have flowers available for early and late season pollinators. All flowers are beautiful, but only some actually support the pollinators. If fuller petals and brighter colors and longer bloom time is your goal, mix in a few of those pollinator favorites as well for a balance of function and beauty in your garden. If it survives all winter, it must be hardy. Survival does not equal thriving. A plant might limp through the winter but struggle long term due to its soil, its moisture, or its exposure. Hardiness is only one piece of the puzzle. A plant can survive in the winter and still struggle to regrow in the spring. It grows weak, sparse, or just stunted looking. It might even bloom poorly or not at all. And it might be stressed just year after year. Just because a plant doesn't die doesn't mean it's truly happy where it's planted. Why survival alone is not enough, many plants hang on through the winter because of a mild winter, extra snow coverage that acts as insulation, or even heavy mulching, or are protected by a building that is nearby that's giving off some heat. But that doesn't mean they're reliably hardy for your zone for the long term. What does true hardiness look like? A truly hardy plant will survive consistently. It'll regrow strongly every year. It'll bloom reliably, and it will handle normal temperature swings without special care. Now that's thriving and not just surviving. But we all know that we do like to push the hardiness button. We all kind of have a little bit of zone envy. Don't be afraid to try plants that are outside of your hardiness zone, but just know that they may just survive and not thrive. My final thoughts on all this is a lot of gardening rules are really just guidelines. And the best advice most always depends on your climate, your soil, your plants, and what your garden goals are. To be honest, I'm a rule breaker and I like to garden in my way. Sometimes I win and sometimes I lose. But at the end of the day, if I'm having fun out in my garden with the plants I'm growing, that is what is most important. Don't make gardening feel hard. Do what works for you. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below. If you're new to our channel, I welcome you to subscribe. If you're looking for your favorite annuals and perennials and shrubs, head on over to our website, gardencrossings.com, where we have over 1,500 varieties for you to shop from that we can ship directly to your door.